Church, you can take your seat, and while you're doing that, go ahead and grab your Bible and turn in your Bible to Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38. We are in the study of the book of Job, which has, as it were, been somewhat of a short journey. We're only in the 12th message, and we're about finished with the book. It's a reminder of a story of a man whose world was turned upside down. For 2 chapters, we see that he has, in one day, as life was going on pretty normal, everything was easy breezy, as it were, and then one day the winds blew and his world got turned upside down. He, at that moment, lost all of his possessions, all of his children, and then right on the heels of grieving the loss of that, loses his health. And Job is a man like any believer would. When you struggle with those, why are those things going the way they are? You always wonder, why in the world has God allowed this in my life? And yet, the big message of the book of Job is that for the remainder of the chapters, from chapter 2 to chapter 37, God is silent, and Job cannot figure out why God won't talk to him. Job is filled with why questions. His friends have come. They have not helped him at all. And his own inner wrestlings with the struggles that go through our minds, like Job's minds, never satisfied him at all. He has demanded in that section where God is silent an audience with God. He really, as it were, appeals to God as the judge of the world and says, I want to have a word with you. And so it's important to know that as we come to this section we're in, which begins in chapter 38, and it goes all the way to chapter 42, the final 5 chapters of the book, God is finally going to speak to Job. And as I want to remind you, as we learned last week, as we just surveyed this section, kind of started getting our minds around it, when God speaks to Job in these chapters, there are some obvious things that you need to keep in your mind that are omitted in God's speech. For first of all, there is no condemnation from God. There's not one hint from God to Job that his struggle is because of his sin. That is the default we always go to. There's something going wrong in my life because I've done something wrong. But not in Job's case, and maybe not in your case. Job knows that his why questions are not being answered, and he understands that really it's not because of some sin in his life. And it's not because God is displeased with him and God somehow doesn't like him asking the why questions, and God is just somehow bringing condemnation to bear on him by saying, how could you, Job? How could you ever ask your why questions? There's no hint of condemnation at all. There's no hint of apologies from God. There's never a word in these final chapters where God says, Job, I'm so sorry you went through that. Next time, I won't make it quite as hard on you. There's no apologies. We learned that there are no compliments. God doesn't say, good job, Job, you've hung in there. I mean, I know you struggled. I know you're filled with questions. But nowhere in this section does God ever compliment him for remaining faithful. The devil said he would leave God. He would throw it all off when God put him through the test. And Job has proved that he's not a fake. He has proved that he's the real thing. And yet you don't find in these final chapters God complimenting him. There are no explanations. God doesn't in any way tell Job at all why this took place, what was going on, about the conversation with the devil in the first few chapters. Nobody but God, the devil, and us, the readers, now know that. Job never knew that. This book wasn't something he could pick up and read and say, oh, I know how it ends. I know what's going on. There's no explanations. It would to us make sense if God would just answer the why questions and tell you, here's the reasons, 1, 2, 3, everything has gone this way. But God doesn't do that. What does God do? Well, we learned as we surveyed these chapters last week that God begins to speak to him the very first time in chapter 38 through chapter 40, verse 2. He answers him out of the whirlwind. The Lord, the covenant-keeping God, it's not God, G-O-D, it's L-O-R-D. This covenant-keeping God is speaking to him. And what God does when he speaks to him is he challenges Job. We saw that in chapter 38, verses 1 through 3, where God's first words to Job were to challenge him. And in fact, he asked him over 70 questions to see what Job would answer and how Job would respond. It's almost as if in that silent period where God was silent, Job was saying to God, God, put yourself in my place. You don't understand how hard this is for me. That's kind of what you hear coming out of Job in that section. And now the challenge is turned around. And God says to Job, Job, put yourself in my place. Look at it from my perspective. And so what does God do? God then, after he challenges him, takes him on a tour through his creation. Job is going to tour some of the most magnificent truths about God as the Creator. And that's where we landed last week. It's where we ended. Just a survey, seeing really the challenge that God had given to Job, and really the challenge to survey and walk with him, as it were, just like you would in a zoo, by each animal and observe it and look at it. Now, I want to say something that I thought about this week, and I really, just in a fresh way, was reminded of what an amazing and powerful place is about the doctrine of the creation of God. This doctrine of creation, particularly for sufferers, is something that we want to pay close attention to. I've always, all my life, believed in 6 literal days of creation, that God made the world that exists out of nothing. He took nothing that was in existence, but made everything that is in existence, and he created it in 6 literal days. But I don't think, until my study in Job, that I started realizing the incredible impact that the doctrine of creation has on the sufferer. Think of it like this, brothers and sisters. When Job has been asking all these why questions, God doesn't give him a response on the doctrine of suffering. He gives him a response on the doctrine of creation. And in the New Testament, this is the verse that grabbed me this last week here. So, as Peter says in 1 Peter 4:9, a chapter on suffering as believers. So then those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful, you see that word there? Creator. Listen, if you're suffering, you're right where God's put you. That suffering is a part of his will for you. What you need to learn to do is commit yourself to this faithful Creator. And while you commit yourself to the faithful Creator, just continue doing what is good. And what that means is doing the things that God has given us in his word and called us to do as his people. And so Job is not given a doctrine on suffering, so to speak, in these final words from God, but he is given a doctrine of creation. Now, let me show you why I think this is so important to us. It's so incredibly important to us. When we fail to grasp the glory and the wonder, as Psalm 19 says, that the heavens and earth are shouting, as it were, every day to us. The heavens declare the glory of God day into day, night into night. They are uttering a speech. They're talking to us. If we don't grasp what the glory is that God is revealing in that creation, we'll miss an incredible truth that we need in the midst of our trials and our suffering. It's almost like this. I am so used to living where I live in this beautiful part of the world. And like you, I've gone to many places throughout the world. And it's somewhat like I just can't get used to getting up in God's world. And I'm kind of like used to it. And what God is going to say to Job is, you might be used to all this around you, but you've never really probably stopped and listened to what it's saying to you. How it's pointing to me. How it's reminding you of some incredible things you need to know about me. Now I was thinking this week, so what is the outcome or the result of not really paying attention to the creation? In fact, maybe just not even realizing that it is a creation that God has made. What is the outcome of that? Well, I'm going to take the worst case scenario, obviously, just to make the point. And that worst case scenario can come from a man named Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan, as you know, was known as a scientific celebrity with a TV show and everything. He was the renowned astronomer, not to mention he was an antagonistic atheist who was constantly tearing down the doctrine of creation. He became the leading voice for what is called naturalism. Now, that may seem like a big word to you. Naturalism just simply means this. I like a real simple definition, right? Naturalism simply means this. You can explain everything around you just based on natural stuff. It's all natural. It's not supernatural. It's just natural. So naturalism is everything is called and causes by something natural and has an explanation in something natural. I was reading some time back about an interesting passage in the Bible where Jesus walks on the water. Remember the disciples are in the boat and all that, and they're walking. He's walking on water out to them in the midst of that storm, calms it all down. One naturalist said this: well, what really happened there was there were little ice plates all over the water. And Jesus was just surfing, as it were, on the top of the water with these little pieces of ice. Now, I don't know if they even stop and think about how silly that sounds. In hot Israel, on ice, right? That doesn't even make natural sense to me, right? And that's what a naturalist does. He explains away the supernatural and the miracle. And when a person develops a naturalism outlook, particularly as it relates to creation, and turns to an evolution view of how the world began and how it is held together, it is nothing but a downward spiral. And particularly when suffering comes into your world. Sagan looked at the universe, and he was known for this in all of his speeches. His conclusion of his message was simply this: that there is nothing greater than what we see. I quote him: "The universe is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." So it's not that a naturalist is trying to remove faith. What they're doing is replacing their faith. I mean, everybody's looking at something, trying to make sense of it. We as Christians are looking to God and His Word and His revelation. A naturalist is looking at the things around us, and they have replaced faith with the universe and creation. In fact, it gets this neat little name called Mother Earth. And that's what happens when naturalism begins to take hold of a person's soul, is all those attributes that you would think of God start being assigned to the creation itself rather than the Creator. So what does that do? Well, in the end, here's what it does. It leads to the utter insignificance of humanity. That's what it does. Taken to its real end and its real final thought, if really the universe is all there is and there's nothing more, and as Carl Sagan will remind us in a minute, in the end we're just a real piece of blob on a big rock, then it really is removing the significance of a soul, significance of a human being. Let me just share two real short quotes and little stories from some journalists who have written based on a naturalist perspective on the universe, and how that system of thinking ultimately brought them to a place to where their faith was in the creation around them. One elderly retired woman who grew up just like you and me, went to a mainline Protestant church most of her life, wrote these words: "I am sitting on our small deck, knitting and resting old legs, entertained by my spiritual sister, an equally old pine tree. She is at least as old as I am. She leans a bit, so do I. We both soak in the sun and the air and are trying our best to live lightly in our worlds. One day in the not too distant future, she will fall and fertilize the earth, and so will I." It is a consoling thought. Now, I don't know what's consoling about that, but that's what she thinks. "I've lost," she writes, "my traditional heaven and hell beliefs. There are those who want to give my life more importance than the tree, but I don't believe them." Now, I just couldn't help but, as I was reading that, remind myself, she is sitting in a rocking chair made of wood on a wooden porch, right? So I think she's a little elevated above the tree. She writes, "They think there is a special place for someone for eternity, but I don't believe them. I believe my tree and all other living things believe and feel in their particular living way." That is insignificance in that woman's life. The other article I read was from a published poet and a professor at the University of New Mexico. He writes in his article, "I believe in the sun," not S-O-N, S-U-N, "in the tangible of all human failures of fear, greed, and forgetfulness. The sun gives me clarity. The sun is our relative and illuminates our path on this earth. Humans are vulnerable and rely on the kindness of the earth and the sun." Now, do you see this? Kindness of the earth and the sun. That's an attribute. It's assigning divine attributes to the creation. He goes on to write, "One day recently, I walked out of a hotel room just off Times Square at dawn to find the sun. It was the fourth morning since the birth of my fourth granddaughter. I had bundled up the baby and carried her outside. I held her up and presented her to the sun so she would be recognized as a relative, so that she wouldn't forget this connection, this promise, so that we all remember the sacredness of life." I want to just ask you a question. What kind of way will that help a sufferer like Job? In no way. What it's going to do is remove every bit of significance, and life will become nothing but an utter insignificance. Paul writes about it like this in Romans 1, verses 21 to 25. You can just jot this down as we're kind of introducing where we're going in these chapters this morning. He says that the unbeliever becomes futile in his speculation. Their foolish heart is darkened, and they suppress the truth of the Creator and elevate the creation. That's exactly what the naturalist is doing. Mankind becomes nothing more than an animal with no more dignity and personal worth than a pine tree. That is what this is really dangerous about. Listen to the closing words of Carl Sagan's life and the things he wrote. He says, "Our planet is a speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves." Well, I think Job needs to hear there is someone who will come and save him, who will come and rescue him, who will come and help him try to make sense of his turned upside down world and the struggles that he has. So what God says is he tells us, as we read in 1 Peter 4:19, commit yourself to a faithful Creator. This Creator is faithful. And what this will do is bring the believer back from the edge of despair, and it breathes fresh hope into his soul. You're wondering why your world is turned upside down. You're trying to figure out all the questions to the whys of your life. Here is the place to start. Commit yourself to your faithful Creator. That's what you do. Now, let's come to Job chapter 38, and let's just kind of walk through 2 points this morning. First of all, God is going to remind Job of his creative care. He's going to take him, as it were, just picture as it were if you can, just for the sake of imagery, walking through the zoo, stopping and reading and stopping and looking at the various animals. God is going to remind Job of his creative care in that, and each time he does that, it brings home a point of how the Creator God that we commit our soul to will keep us and sustain us in our most difficult and trying hours. And then, after God tours him through those zoo, as it were, to look at those animals, he's going to ask Job for a response. And we'll see what Job responds with. And we'll see, hopefully, that that's the same response that we have in our own heart and life. So, there are 8 animals that we're going to look at in chapter 38 through chapter 39. 8 animals, and yes, you can be sure they all start with the same letter. Not the animals, but my characteristic of what that animal is like. Be a way to hopefully help you remember it. It's almost as if as we go through this, God is saying to Job, Job, you don't think I care about you? You don't think I know what's going on in your life? You don't think I'm in control of that? Let me show you a few of these animals. Some that fly, some that can never fly. Some that put eggs up on the side of a mountain, some that put eggs in the ground. Some that really are the most strange and unusual part of creation. Some that can run fast, some that can't hardly move at all and are slow. But I want you to know, all of these are reminding you, if you'll just take time and look at them, of my care and my creative power over them. So let's walk through them rather quickly. The first one he's going to point to, I'm calling a strong animal, and that is found in chapter 38, verses 39 and 40, and that is the lion. Look at chapter 38, verse 39, if you have your Bible open. He asked Job, can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? When they crouch in their dens and lie in wait in their lair, who prepares for the raven its nourishment when its young cry out for food and wander about with food? So I don't know where verse 40 stops at, right? Obviously. Look back up at those 2 verses, if you will. The truth is that he asked Job to consider the lion, and the question is, have you done that? And probably Job's response and my response would be, no, I haven't considered him. Why would I want to consider him? This is a strong animal. This is an animal to be feared. But God is reminding Job here that he has designed him with the ability to do just what he does. I don't know if you've ever taken the time to do a Google search on lions, but, being a pastor and in a passage where it's talking about lions, I thought I'd find out a little bit about a lion. And I discovered that a lion, the average weight of a lion is up to 600 pounds and stands about 4 feet high. Now, I've been at zoos like you within a few feet of them, and I can almost in my mind remember when one of them was there and they were purring. It sounded like a car engine idling. And I was thanking God that there was, as it were, that barrier between us and that lion. So what is the point that is this, as he asked him this question, can you hunt for the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens and lie in wait in their lair? What is he trying to say to Job? Job had no ability or desire to care for these frightening predators, right? Not at all. But God was caring for him. Job, when it looks like to you that the most frightening, terrifying thing of your life has come, if I can take care of this lion, control this lion, can't I control that in your life? Well, having moved from this strong animal that he wants him to look at, he moves to an animal on the different end, and this is going to be the raven, and this is a skittish animal, if you will. This is an animal that, boy, it takes off real quickly when anything rattles it. Now, of all the birds that I was reading about, this bird, I wouldn't have picked as one to point out to think about some of the majesty and glory of God. This bird here is a raven that is a bird that just jumps and runs away when it gets close to something. And what it's known for, this large black bird, is not only its unpleasant call, but it's one of those things that you think has no real benefit to mankind unless you like scavengers. This is a raven that eats anything including decomposing flesh and has been known to hunt with the wolves to eat the remaining carcasses when it's left. There's no doubt that Job had seen ravens eating remains of dead animals. And so in verse 41, who prepares for the raven its nourishment? When its young cry to God and wander about without food. You know the answer is God does that. So Job, here is the animal that is somewhat like of no value to you, I would imagine. And if God wanted to care for something like that, it's really just like a no value bird to you. Don't you think that God cares more for you? Don't you think that really, if a raven here, a little bird that really is just a scavenger going around eating something, and God, when this bird cries out to him, as it were, for its food, provides for him, don't you think, Job, that in your suffering and in your questions, you could at least be content in your soul to first say, I know that God will provide for me? He controls the roaring, raging lion. He absolutely provides for this little animal called a raven. You know, as I read that, I couldn't help but remember what Jesus said to us and to his disciples in Luke chapter 12 when he made this statement about birds. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents? And the idea of a little sparrow here is the idea of a sacrificial animal, the cheap little animal that is being sacrificed for sacrifices. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents? Yet not one of them is forgotten before God. Are you kidding me? Not even a little cheap bird used in the sacrifices. You don't forget it, God? No. In other words, not even this small sacrificial sparrow is outside of the providence and care of God. And you remember Jesus in Luke 12 concluded in verse 7 by saying, or rather asking, are you not more valuable than a bird? You see, this tour through the zoo, as he comes to this little raven that seems like a no-value bird at all, or like a sparrow in the New Testament that seems so small and insignificant that not one of them is out of the care and sight of your Father. Job, can't you for a moment in your suffering put your why questions aside for just a little bit and say, you know what? I do know he sees. I know he cares. I know he is watching over me. This is a very, very important message. See, if we lose the doctrine of creation and go like the culture around us that just says, well, it's just cosmos, it's just stuff, it's just here by evolutionary process, we start losing the significance and the wonder of God's care. And he's saying, aren't you more valuable than a bird? So he's looked at a lion, which is a strong animal. He's looked at a raven and wanted Job to see the skittishness, the seemingly fleeting, running away little animal. And then finally, look at chapter 39, which hits a little more home to where we live. It's the deer. Chapter 39, verse 1. Do you know the time the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Can you count the mouths they fulfill? Or do you know the time they give birth? They kneel down, they bring forth their young, they get rid of their labor pains, their offsprings become strong and grow up in the open field. They leave and do not return to them. What is he saying here? Well, I've defined this little animal, this deer, as the shy animal. And why I call them shy is because I don't see them till nighttime, right? I've got 4 that come around my house, right? I'll go out in the morning, about 4 or 5 in the morning. It's dark, and I've got this big flashlight, and I just see eyeballs, right? I never see them in the daytime because that is the very nature of this animal. They are shy. It's as if he's saying to Job, Job, I see them all the time. I know where they are. I know where they're grazing at. I know it when they're having their labor pains. I know when the deer is giving birth. I know that. Do you know that, Job? Are you seeing that? The point is, Job, I see them all the time. Do you think I'm not seeing your suffering? Well, he moves from a strong animal, a skittish animal, a shy animal, now to verses 5 through 8. And we're going to call this one the stubborn animal because he's going to talk about the wild donkey. Look at what he says in verse 5. Who sent out the wild donkey free? And who loosened the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I gave the wilderness for a home and the salt land for his dwelling place? Verse 7, he scorns the tumult of the city, the shoutings of the driver he does not hear. He explores the mountains for his pastures and searches after every green thing. Again, God is asking Job, Job, has the donkey ever asked you for permission to roam anywhere? And the answer is no. Actually, the donkey wants to go opposite you. This wild creature does not want to listen. We read in that verse there, verse 7, that this animal scorns the tumult of the city, the shoutings of the driver. He does not hear. In other words, if you say the donkey, go left, where does he go? He goes right. Right? Tell him to stop. He wants to go. He doesn't listen to you. And yet God is reminding Job here of this stubborn animal that he absolutely controls. And the point again for Job is that God not only assigned this animal to a habitat, this wild donkey, but Job, think about this. I've assigned your place as well. Imagine God not only created you for a place, listen very carefully, but he created a place in life for you. He didn't just create this world and just say, okay, wherever you land, you land. No, he put you right where you are. Controls your habitation. If God has something to say about the place where an ordinary wild donkey lives, surely isn't God looking at and watching and making sure you're right in your sorrow and your suffering where you need to be? God is implying to Job, I have determined your habitat right now, and it's only come about by my permission and my providence. Where you are and what you're going through, don't forget, Job, that's under my control as well. Well, after this wild donkey, he moves to an interesting one that I found in verses 9 through 12 of chapter 39, and I call this one a sturdy animal. Some of your translations are obviously, as we read those verses, going to read a wild ox, right? But the King James, if you have that translation out there, it's the word unicorn. Notice what he says in verse 9. Will the wild ox or the unicorn consent to serve you? Or will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in a furrow with ropes? Or will he harrow the valleys after you? In other words, don't get in your mind this is your typical ox who literally is just in front of the plow and you're controlling it. That's not. This is a wild, uncontrollable animal. Now, the interesting thing about this animal is that it probably became extinct some years ago. There's no way to find one of these animals around anymore. I'm going to go with the best interpretation of most of the commentators, and they say that this animal is probably an oryx. It's something like this massive, large animal that's 6 feet wide at the shoulders and had long horns pointing forward. That's why it's referred to in the King James as a unicorn. Now, interesting, in Psalm 22, which you know is a messianic psalm, it's a psalm about the death of Christ. When he's talking about the horrors of the cross and what is going on there, one of the phrases that are used about the horrors and the attack that's happening to Christ is it writes in verses 11 and 12 of Psalm 22, "Many bulls have surrounded me, bulls of Bashan have encircled me." It's probably the same animal. It's like they are thrusting me with their power and their wildness. These were not domesticated oxen that you plow with. These were wild animals that could kill you in a dozen ways if it chose to do it. And so the point for Job again is God is asking him the question, Job, do you think you can tame an auroch? Can you hitch him up to your plow? The answer is obviously no, but I can control him, says God. And do you think I can't control the wildest and most powerful situation you're in? Now what you're seeing here is as God is asking Job these questions, they are not questions that are intended for Job to give an answer to. They are intended to humble Job. They are intended to get Job to realize that what has happened in his life is I've been looking at this thing all wrong. I've been saying, God, you need to look at this. Look at what I'm going through. And God is saying, you need to look at it from my perspective. You need to change your view here. And so he looks at this sturdy, strong, powerful animal that even God has control over. The next one I mentioned to you last week, so we won't spend much time on him. It's the ostriches, and it points out here the strange animal that God has created. Think about this. God is walking Job, as it were, through the zoo saying, hey, look at that lion. Isn't that a strong animal? Look at that raven, how skittish it is. Flies away, just a scavenger hunter, as it were. Seems like of no value at all. Look at that deer, shy. Nobody knows where it is, but I know where it is. Look at that wild donkey. It can't be controlled by anything, but I can control it. Now look at that ox, that sturdy, strong animal that seems like it could just tear you to pieces. I can control it. I can control your circumstances. And then finally, he has him to look at the ostrich. I'm just going to read those verses and let you again see what let's just say it straight up, a stupid bird, right? The ostrich's wings flap joyously with the pinion and plumage of love. For she abandons her eggs to the earth and warms them in the dust. And this is the interesting thing about how stupid this bird is, right? This bird, it has its eggs, buries some of them in the sand, but leaves some out of the sand. Why does it do that? Just in case it needs some extra food for its newborns to eat. That's what he's saying. Verse 15. And she forgets that a foot may crush them, right? These laid over there. She just has no protection over them. Or that a wild beast may trample them. She treats her young cruelly as if they were not hers. Though her labor be in vain, she is unconcerned. Because God has made her forget wisdom and has not given her a share of understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she laughs at the horse and his rider. So here is this animal, this strange, odd bird. It's the largest living bird, weighing up to 300 pounds and a height of about 8 feet. We had one show up in our yard here in Rabun County one day, and we saw just what a crazy bird that thing is. It's back when our children were real little. Pam calls me. I'm at the then existing office of our church then, and she said, Kevin, you need to get home. Right now, the kids said there's men running around in the yard with a rope and a knife, and they've got blood all over them. So what I do, I get in the car and I'm running home, and I meet the police coming from my house, and I said, hey, I need to know we know all about what's going on. Everything's taken care of. So I get to my drive, and I looked, and these two guys are sitting there with their clothes basically torn off, blood all over them, and yes, a rope in their hand. And I said, are you guys okay? They said, yeah, but this bird, it is crazy. They had that ostrich right there behind them. They had to capture it, and they killed the bird. Oh, I know. Yeah. Huh? Tranquilize it. Yeah. Okay, forever. It's a stupid bird, right? And here's the point of all this for Job. Job might be thinking, if he looked at the ostrich, what in the world was God thinking when he created this ostrich? And there are times that you and I look at the circumstances God has placed us in, and we might be tempted to say, God, what are you thinking? What, this doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? What are you thinking? What sense can I make of what you've created in my life? It doesn't add up. But God has designed some of the strangest, most bizarre creatures, this bird, this ostrich, for his glory, to show his creativity and even his care. Real quickly, let's wrap this up. Number 7, he looks at the horse. Chapter 39, verses 19 through 25. I won't read those for you. We all know what a horse is. But I see this one as he's pointing out to him the stately animal that a horse is. One commentator wrote, "The horse's majesty, energy, strength, impatience for the battle, and spirit are proofs of the greatness of him who made him. Job," he writes, "you might be able to train a battle horse, but who gave him his eagerness to fight? Who made him race into enemy forces? Who allowed him to smell war and swallow up the ground in a race to get there first?" Perhaps this is a subtle hint to Job to not run from the battle, but to run towards the battle. Not try to flee it, but say, I'm ready for the war. I'm ready for the challenge. God, I will go through this, even if I don't know why I have to. Just as the horse is courageous in the face of conflict, the implication, one author wrote, was that God could also make Job confident as he faced his devastating trials. And so can we. Paul reminded Timothy of this in 2 Timothy 3:17, where he says, God has thoroughly equipped us for every good work. Everything we need in his word, it's there to equip us. And Peter reminds us in his epistle in 2 Peter 1:4 that everything we need for life and godliness is found in Christ and in those exceeding and precious promises. Okay, last animal number 8 on the tour. God points out a stunning animal, this hawk or this eagle that is mentioned in chapter 39, verses 26 through 30. The hawk or the eagle. Look at what he says in verse 26. It is by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings toward the south. Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? Just a couple of things that are amazing about this animal. An eagle has an eye, I was told, that has 8 times as many visual cells per cubic centimeter than a human eye. Intricately made. Now, I don't even have any idea what that means in the sense that it has 8 times visual cells and all that stuff. I just know it sounds like a lot, right? Okay. What I do understand is that the eagle flying at 600 feet elevation can watch a spider crawl across your driveway. An eagle can see a fish the size of your hand jumping from 5 miles away. So the point I think he is trying to impress him with, again, is this. Job, I have my eye on everything. I have it on all things. There's nothing that will pass by or come in your life that I will not see. As Francis Anderson says in his commentary on this section, he says, Job does not say, now I see everything, God, it all makes sense to me. But what he does say is, now I see God. I see him. I don't see all of it. I don't understand all of it. I don't understand why this trial is in my life, but I do understand that I see God in his greatness, in his power, his creativity, and his care. Surely, though I don't know my answers to my why questions, I do know that he does care for me. Let's quickly, as we just look at chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, and watch Job respond. The Lord asks him this question. He reminds him. Then the Lord said to Job, after he's taking him through this tour, showing him these animals, the creativity and the care of God over creation, and obviously implying, I will do all those, I am doing all those for you, Job. Verse 1 of chapter 40. Then the Lord said to Job, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. Isn't that an amazing statement? He's calling Job a fault finder. The reason Job is finding fault with God and thinks that God is not running his world well and that this is not right that he has been going through and he's struggling through it is because he's finding fault with the Almighty. He's finding fault with him. God has let Job cry out to him. He has let Job question and struggle through that. But in the end, God is reminding him what you've been doing is ultimately finding fault with me. Now here's what Job's going to do. Job is not going to have his why questions answered, but he's going to quit questioning God. His questions are not answered ever, anywhere in the book. But his questioning of God is now going to be over. What was it that calmed him down? It was that he was able now, as Peter reminded us earlier, to commit his soul to the keeping of a faithful Creator. God, if this is your creation, magnificently, gloriously is used, designed, and you care for it. And some of it doesn't even make sense to me why you would make the creation the way you do. But surely I have more value than the creation as far as animals and inanimate things. Surely you care for me. Job is reminding him here, or God is reminding Job here, that really, though back earlier you were saying to me in chapter 31, verse 35, let the Almighty answer me. I'm waiting. Let him respond to me. I have responded to you, Job. Are you going to still end up with the response of finding fault? Well, the answer is obviously no. So Job responds here in verses 3 and 4. Then Job answered the Lord and said, here's what he said. Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? Now, he doesn't mean I come of no value like Carl Sagan is saying. What he means is that in light of your greatness, I'm pretty small. My suffering, as hard as it is not as magnificent and big as you. Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer, even twice, and I will add nothing more. As I thought through those verses, I saw three things that Job was doing, and I think it's the three things that you and I will do when we give up asking our why questions in the sense of questioning God, thinking he's done us wrong. If you can get to that place of contentment, you will have these three components going on in your life just like Job was. Number one, first of all, Job was surrendered. I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I give, God. I just give. I'm not bringing myself up to the level with you saying, hey, I demand an answer. You tell me now. No, he is being quiet. He's insignificant. There's really nothing else after this grand tour of your glory in creation and the care of your creation that will make me want to say anything else. Secondly, he was silenced. I lay my hand on my mouth. I'm done with the questioning of God. I'm done with the accusations that this is not right. I don't understand why it is. I've got plenty of why questions, but I am silenced. I am okay. And finally, he was submissive. And I will add nothing more. I'll be submissive. Nothing more. You don't owe me another explanation. I get it. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So I think that one of the summaries that I would have for you, and I think would be a good summary that would come from this section of Job this morning, is this. Are we willing to turn from questions we so diligently and desperately want answers to and desire explanation for to the God we so desperately need? Am I willing to turn from the questions I so diligently and desperately want answers to and desire explanations for, and turn away from those and turn to the God I so desperately need? That's what this tour through the zoo has been for Job, to show him this God that he so desperately needs. You see, in one sense, the story of God's first message to Job is to bring him to the place to see that everything has been now turned around to look differently. Job, as it were, has called God into court, asking for a response, and Job thought that somehow he would absolutely come out on top and have it all figured out. But everything's been turned around. Job, actually, in putting God, as it were, on trial, has been caught in his own testimony. Speak to me. Show me yourself. And God did. And it just reversed everything. As I was thinking, and I'll close with this story. As I was thinking about Job and how now in this section everything has kind of been turned around. What he started out doing ended up being turned around on him. I was reminding of a story that Charles Swindoll told, a true story, in his commentary, his little commentary on Job. Here's how the article goes. Listen carefully as we close. A Charlotte, North Carolina lawyer purchased a box of very rare and expensive cigars and then insured them against fire, among other things, Within a month, having smoked his entire stockpile of 24 cigars, the lawyer filed claim against the insurance company. In his claim, the lawyer stated the cigars were lost, quote, in a series of small fires. The insurance company refused to pay, citing the obvious reasons, that the man had consumed the cigars himself, and insurance claims against fire damage cannot mean the same thing as the fire whereby he himself had consumed the cigars. The court sided with the lawyer, and he actually won. In delivering the ruling, the judge agreed with the insurance company that the claim was frivolous. The judge stated, nevertheless, the lawyer held a policy from the company in which it had warranted that the cigars were insurable and also guaranteed that it would insure them against fire without defining what is considered to be an unacceptable fire, and thus were obliged to pay the claim. To the surprise of everyone, the insurance company accepted the ruling and paid $15,000 to the lawyer for his loss of the 24 cigars lost in the fires. The lawyer was rather proud of himself in his clever deed. Now here, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. After the lawyer cashed the check, the insurance company had him arrested on 24 counts of arson. With his own testimony used against him, the lawyer was convicted of intentionally setting fire to insured property 24 different times and was sentenced to 2 years in jail and $24,000 fine. That is a great story. And it is a reminder, in a humorous sense, what in a serious sense happened with Job. Job has accused God and said, I think you're not running the world right. And that accusation was then turned around, and God said, no, look at this creation. I think I'm running it right. Are you going to be content to turn away from your questions, your why questions that you so desperately want answers for, and you keep diligently seeking an answer to, and turn to the God you so desperately need? Are you going to do that, Job? Are you going to put your hand over your mouth and just say nothing else about it? That is the response. That is the response of a person who is surrendered, who is silent, and submitted to God. Now, I'm telling you, in my counseling experience with people who have gone through suffering, that is not a quick or an easy place to get to. That's why the book of Job is 42 chapters long, because it's not easy to get to. But it is the place that we must get to, where we can literally put our hands over our mouths and stop talking, stop complaining, stop grumbling, stop accusing God, and saying, I'm okay. I've got you. That's enough. I hope that'll be your response. God's got some more he's going to say to Job, and it's going to be more lessons to us about God speaking to us in those times of trials. But the first one is being content with the God who controls everything. Let's pray together.